Hello, this is Grant Sherrod with Double Conscious. This week we're talking about Motown music, cognitive models, coping mechanisms, and white appreciation and integration. Here we go. Motown was popular in the 1950s and was based off jazz, big bands, and blues music, but focused more on melodies, glamour, and conservatism. The glamour of Motown was shown through bands like the Marvelettes, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, and the Temptations. These groups in Motown were a whole new way of looking at black music and black people. Jazz music was the biggest sensation around the world and brought attention to black music, but the personalities of some of the musicians, such as Miles Davis, were not as clean cut as the 1950s conservative Americans would have liked. Motown artists were featured in clean cut suits, had choreography, and sang more about relatable topics like love, life, and with a goal of universality in mind, but still used black styles of jazz, blues, and gospel to throw into the mix. The universality brought many black and white crowds together during a time of integration. However, many times people would not go into the concerts unless the vinyl rope that separated whites and blacks was taken down, creating an atmosphere of protesting for integration. The glamour in music also attracted bands like the Beatles, which did a cover of Mr. Postman, but people thought it was a Beatles song and not a Marvelette song. So, Berry Gordy, the owner of Motown Records, scheduled a massive Motown tour in Europe that would only play integrated theaters, to low attendance, but had mass admiration from the crowds. The most important part of Motown is how black musicians started to see themselves and how fans started seeing black musicians. The human mind develops coping mechanisms to function in a world that gets more confusing and challenging as we grow up. These coping mechanisms help us understand ourselves and others so we can function well. If we don't have coping mechanisms for certain things, then we freeze up or we get angry. As a result, our coping mechanisms try to simplify the information we receive in order to simplify the confusing world into an understandable model. Models are similar to how we use a map. A useful map is not exactly like the road, with every detail of how many pebbles are in the ground, or it actually isn't the same size as the road itself, but it reduces the amount of information to provide a useful understanding to how to navigate the road to get to our destination. The models that we create for others are often reduced and may even be influenced by our coping mechanisms and fears. The same goes for ourselves. How we view ourselves is a result of our coping mechanisms. Motown musicians mostly grew up during harsh racism and after the Great Depression and World Wars. These events were highly complicated scenarios that some people got angry at other people for, such as minorities. As a result, these musicians grew up in the harshest of economic circumstances in times of intense racism and developed coping mechanisms for that. The coping mechanisms that they used were probably music and going to church, which the church's musical influence can be heard in Motown and really all American black music. As a result of these coping mechanisms, probably hundreds of layers down, these musicians sometimes constructed negative self-models. A self-model is the way people view themselves built around their coping mechanisms. At the time of Motown, the Marvelettes couldn't even put their own pictures on the album covers because they were afraid it wouldn't sell. However, in the first massive Motown Records tour of the United Kingdom met the Motown artists with warm and excited welcomes. This was overwhelming to most Motown artists because they had not developed coping mechanisms or models of themselves to see this many Europeans excited for their performances and entrance to their country. In Motown, you start to see how black women and men stood up proud and focused on seeing themselves as valuable, beautiful, talented, and respected. Maxine Powell was in charge of the artist imagery at Motown Records, and she created a sort of charm school for the women and chivalry school for the men. Her philosophy was class will help you cross over anywhere. It has nothing to do with black, and regardless of your wealth or poverty or background, class will turn the heads of kings and queens. Female singers that grew up poor and during the demeaning times of segregation, that included practices of having different water fountains, different restaurants, and attending different schools, did not believe Maxine Powell. Powell would tell them that they would sing before kings and queens and that they were diamonds that she was going to polish. The singers had not developed coping mechanisms or self-models for these words, so they would laugh it off. But Motown actually made this happen. Some Motown artists, like the Supremes, did end up dining with royalty in lavish mansions and palaces in Europe. Berry Gordy, the owner of Motown Records, knew that black men would not be accepted by whites if they danced provocatively, so the dances were choreographed to still show manliness but not be provocative. This was a shift in focusing the attention away from the passionate, provocative views that were portrayed on black people because of the jazz age, so that audiences would more focus on the humanity and creativity of Motown acts. This focus shifted away from objectifying what we call the black body and showed a deeper appreciation for the class, dignity, and unity shown in black music and culture, the metaphysical properties, which helped shift the cognitive models whites had of black people. With the provocativeness of the black body played down so the music, class, and choreography were played up, whites started to become enamored with Motown. The groups like the Marvelettes and the Supremes were described as polished. Most whites in the United Kingdom had not been around black people. So when these female groups came in with stunning red dresses, stylish hair, and graceful movements, the fans fell in love and appreciated the black women in a new artistic and newly found romantic sense. This new universal appeal shifted the models in white people's minds of black people and black culture. This was very important because more Motown gigs and clubs were becoming integrated, and people actually protested to have these shows be integrated. The shifting cognitive models raised black self-esteem and increased whites' appreciation of Motown singers and of black people in general. Motown was the beginnings of white and black folks engaging in non-competitive arenas and seeing each other as fellow human beings with commonalities as well as appreciation of differences. This unity between white and black would be helpful in setting the stage for the 1960s civil rights movement. Questions to think about. 1. Why do people have coping mechanisms? How and why are they developed? 2. What is a cognitive model? 3. How did Motown shift the cognitive models of whites and blacks? 4. What cognitive models do you have of yourself? So thank you, Motown Music. The next video is going to be on James Brown and his role in forming the sacred canopy of black values, beliefs, and identity during the 1960s. Stay double conscious. I'm Grant Sherrod, and we'll see you next time.